Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I remember talking about this story a couple of years ago, that Jerry Seinfeld, who's a well-known car collector, had sold a car through an auction. And the people who bought the car at the auction came back later and said, this car is not as it was presented. And the buyer of the car got into dispute with Jerry Seinfeld, who was in essence the previous owner. But the car had passed through an auction. And so I believe all these parties were arguing amongst themselves. And Jerry said, I bought the car from somebody else who presented it to me as this, and it was something that was understandable that I'd believe. So I believe that by the time the dust settled, you had four parties involved in this dispute. You had the original seller, Jerry Seinfeld, the auction, and the guy who bought it at the auction. And it appears that this lawsuit has now been settled. And took a while. But the headline from Reuters is Jerry Seinfeld settles lawsuit over alleged fake 1958 Porsche. And Jeremy sent me the story, thanks a lot. And this involves a bunch of high-powered law firms like you wouldn't believe. So for instance, among the law firms mentioned is Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. I got a former classmate of mine who is a partner there. And that's a big powerhouse. And that's just one of the three big law firms involved here. But Jerry Seinfeld is said to have settled his lawsuit. And the lawsuit had accused him of selling a fake Porsche at a 2016 auction for $1.54 million. And of course, we are here now several years after 2016, so these things take time. And the question is about the authenticity of some aspects of the car. I don't think they're claiming it wasn't really a Porsche. It's just, was it the type of Porsche that it was described as being? Seinfeld also is said to have settled a related lawsuit he filed against the company he bought the car from, which is a California classic car dealer. He had bought the car from them in 2013 for $1.2 million. And so you have to think about it and go, wait a second. These people sold a car in 2013, and here they are all these years later having to settle a lawsuit over that. So the settlement was disclosed in the sense that documents were filed with the court in Manhattan Federal Court, and some documents got filed saying the parties have settled. And it's not uncommon that a lawsuit gets filed, litigation ensues, and somewhere along the line, the parties reach an agreement amongst themselves. They sign a bunch of documents amongst themselves, and then they file not that document with the court, but they file a document with the court simply saying the parties hereby stipulate to dismiss this case with prejudice. This case will be dismissed. We've resolved it. Thank you very much. We would all like to go home now. And the court will review that and file it. So it's subject to the final closing of the file by the court, but the documents have been filed, and courts almost never say anything bad about this because they like to see cases settled because it gets another case off of their docket. So the attorney from Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, who represents Seinfeld, was involved in this, as was a company called Fika Frio Limited. Fika Frio Limited. They are a Channel Islands-based entity. Now, the Channel Islands, as you might guess, are islands in the channel. But it's one of those things where occasionally you hear about people in America who buy very, very expensive exotic cars and register them in other states for various legal advantages they think they might gain by doing so. Well, likewise, ownership of a car that costs millions of dollars, as you can imagine, if you can buy or sell that car and not have to pay, sales tax, that might come in handy. And so you might try to find some place that you can domicile your business so that you can take advantage of that. So Fika Frio Limited is a Channel Islands-based entity that bought the car from Seinfeld at that auction. And they were represented by a law firm called Brown Rudnick. And meanwhile, the dealership that sold the car to Seinfeld was represented by a law firm of Lindenbury, McCormick, Estabrook, and Cooper. Now, one interesting point here is that Reuters reached out to every single one of these law firms and said, will you comment? And they all said no. Or they actually didn't respond. And that's more common than anything else. You hear that all the time. Reached out for comment, no response was made. But at issue was the Porsche 356A 1500 GSGT Carrera Speedster. I will admit to you, I'm familiar with Porsche automobiles. I'm familiar with the Porsche company. I'm not a huge fan of them. I've ridden in a few of them. I don't know if I've ever driven one. I don't think I have. But it's just not my cup of tea. There's something about them that does not really appeal to me as other foreign cars I like much better. But I know there's guys out there who love them, their Porsches. And Jerry Seinfeld is one. Jay Leno is another. And so Jerry here bought a Porsche 356A 1500 GS GT Carrera Speedster from the dealer in California. And Fika Frio bought it from an auction in Amelia Island. And this happened a couple years ago, but they actually announced that at Amelia Island there's going to be an auction. There's often auctions at these big car shows. And they said that we're going to be selling cars from the Jerry Seinfeld collection. Jerry had a couple cars that he's going to sell, a few cars. And so they said this car is coming from the Jerry Seinfeld collection. And the real question is if that adds value or not. It may or may not add value to the car, but it will certainly add some publicity to the auction. So if the auction house can get more publicity, then that might bring out more bidders, and that might drive the price up a little bit. I'm not sure anybody's going to be bragging and saying, hey, I got this car and Jerry Seinfeld owned it at one time. I'm not sure if that matters in the Porsche collecting world. But so the car sold at Amelia Island for $1.4 million, plus there's a 10% buyer's premium that the buyer had to pay on top of that to, pay off the auction company. So according to papers, Fika Frio is owned by a guy whose mother is Brazilian but is based in Monaco. And of course, he has this entity on the Channel Islands. Fika Frio said it learned about a year after purchase that the car was not authentic, and that's the word they used in the pleadings, when it asked a well-known Porsche dealer to assess it because they were thinking about selling it. So they bought the car, they're thinking about selling it, so they have an expert look at it, and the expert goes, you got a problem here. Now, I've pointed out before that if you buy a car sight on the scene or you haven't had a chance to look at it and then you get it inspected, it often is backwards because if the inspection reveals something after you've bought it, you're stuck with it. However, you can understand why a buyer might rely on statements made by an auction house, in particular with a high-profile car. What are the odds that the car would turn out not to be authentic? So that was the opinion of a well-known Porsche dealer who assessed the vehicle after the purchase. Now, the lawsuit filed in New York said that Seinfeld had apologized in 2018 through a voicemail left with the buyer saying, and here's a quote that's from the pleadings, "You will be completely indemnified in full and not have to keep the car." That's the quote. But a refund was not forthcoming, at least to the point where Fika Frio felt they had to file the lawsuit. So meanwhile, Seinfeld filed a third-party complaint against the people that he bought the car from. And pleading can be very, very confusing. Traditional lawsuit is, I sue you, I'm the plaintiff, you're the defendant. If you counter-sue me in the same transaction, I become the plaintiff counter-defendant, and you are the defendant counter-plaintiff. Got that? Okay. You decide to sue somebody else that I have no cause of action against. So I don't sue them, they don't sue me, but you sue them. So that's a third-party complaint. So it becomes then plaintiff counter-defendant, defendant counter-plaintiff, and third-party defendant. Okay? And it can get really confusing. It can get really confusing. But the third-party complaint was filed against the dealership that Seinfeld bought it from, and he's an avid car collector. He said he actually did not know himself, personal knowledge, whether the vehicle was fake or not, and he asked the car dealer to resolve the dispute with Fika Frio, but they said, that's not our job. We're not going to do that. No, that's your problem now. So he also said that dealership in California should indemnify him if he were held liable to Fika Frio. And meanwhile, the third-party complaint said Mr. Seinfeld, who is a very successful comedian, does not need to supplement his income by building and selling counterfeit sports cars. That's actually true. I'm talking about how rich he is, that he does not need to do that. You probably know that when Seinfeld was on the air, the show, he got paid a boatload of cash per episode to shoot those shows. Then he also owned the show along with Larry David. I'm not sure what percentages they owned or so on, but I understand that in licensing that show in reruns for places like TBS and so on, they've also gotten boatloads of cash to the point where he might be one of those people who's got money that if he tried to spend it all, he'd have a hard time. So the lawsuit was Fika Fria Limited versus Seinfeld and Seinfeld versus European Collectibles, but is all lumped together in the U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York, and the case number starts with a 19, indicating it was in fact filed in 2019. And a bunch of attorneys, like I said, of very high-profile firms were involved in this case. And the fact that Jerry is using Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, again, they're an expensive law firm, but they're good. They're good. So Jerry Seinfeld has apparently settled the lawsuit. And the big question I have, and we don't know the answer to this, whether Fika Frio is going to keep the car and simply be compensated for its diminished value, or if they're going to give the car back. I suspect they're going to keep the car and get some money to compensate them for that. But I don't know. And again, that's one of the things that we sometimes don't ever find out right away. That is how a case settled. And that's because I mentioned earlier that the documents that get filed with the court are simply a dismissal that do not contain the terms of the settlement. And the settlements quite often are confidential. It might be those three parties signed an agreement that says, here's how we're going to settle the case. You pay them, they pay you, you do this, they keep the car, they do this with the car. And we all agree not to talk about it. No one can talk about this. So we might never find out. In fact, as Jerry might say, you put it in the vault. So there you go. From Reuters, Jerry Seinfeld settles lawsuit over alleged fake 1958 Porsche. Jeremy sent it to me. Thanks a lot. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. One characteristic of winners is they always look upon themselves as a do-it-yourself project.